بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وصحبه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليكم.
وعليكم السلام.
Ja, de mensen die me kennen, die weten dat. Ik wil hem echt horen. On behalf of the Student Union, ISA, we'd like to welcome all of you to this two-day event with Dr. Abdullah Hakim Quick. As you have seen, my name is Saud Kajay. I'm the founder and also teacher in Islamic Studies at AboAliMosa Institute for Islamic Studies. And inshallah, for today, I will be your chairman for the session of today. I want to show you something which I mentioned to the Shaykh also. For those people amongst us who are young, do you know what this is? Who of you know what this is? Because maybe there are some people who don't know, they're only from the USB sticks or whatever. This is a cassette tape. A cassette tape. This tape I bought 17 or 18 years ago when I was a student in Islamabad. There was a little shop there with Islamic books and Islamic lectures on tape. There were no CDs at that time, at least not for Islamic studies. So I bought this tape, and just yesterday, when I was sitting with the Shaykh on the invitation of Isa, I received this book. So after 17 or 18 years, my tape is completed with the book of Shaykh Dr. Abdullah Hakim Quick. So I'm very much honored to may have received, it feels like it's complete at this moment, and I'm very thankful for that. And this topic, which is also the title of this book, Deeper Roots, the same like the cassette tape, Deeper Roots. It's a most interesting topic, which is on the discovery of America and the Muslims in that region up till the present times. As it generally is believed, and it is Christopher Columbus who discovered America in 1492. At least this is what generally is thought. The thing is it really so? Was Christopher Columbus the very first person who discovered America? Or is there a deeper roots behind it? Maybe with Muslims. This is something which the Shaykh has proven, and also one of the parts which he will be speaking of today, inshallah. He has elaborated on the history in a most fascinating, academic and very critical way. So he will speak about this also, inshallah. Who is Dr. Abdullah Hakim Quick? As I mentioned, he is very long, for a very long time, he's working in the field of Islamic sciences, Islamic studies, Islamic teachings. He has a very long track record of all the activities in his quest for knowledge and his spreading of knowledge, and also the spreading of knowledge about a lot of societal issues. Shaykh and Dr. Abdullah Hakim Quick is born 66 years ago in the year 1949 in USA, not in Panama, but in USA. This has to be correct. So, and then he migrated to Canada, and he has lived in several countries during his pursuit of knowledge. 45 years ago, in the year 1970, he accepted Islam while in Canada. Dr. Quick began studying in the Islamic University of Medina, and he graduated in 1979, and he was one of the first 2 students who ever graduated who came from the West at that university. Very interesting, just yesterday we had some talks about some people who I also know, and which he gave the Shahada to, so alhamdulillah. So he's a very, even people who are scholars at this time, he did the Shahada with them, and also lived with them, studied with them. It's a very, very big honor for many scholars of this time anyway. Then at the University of Toronto, he completed his master's degree, and he also has a doctorate and a PhD in African history. And just as he mentioned yesterday, even when, for instance, when he was in Medina, also he had to struggle. It wasn't only studying. He also had to provide for his family. So he did his studies while at the same time also working. So working and studying at the same time in the 70s and the 80s, that was quite a difficult time. When we look at Dr. Quick, He has been active for about 40 years in the field of research and teaching about Islam and Islamic society. As a historian, he has special interest in the history of Africa, the Americas, and the Caribbean. He's an expert of the history of colonialism, slavery, and human migration. He has traveled over 61 countries in the Caribbean, Central America, Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. He has played a significant role in the development of Islam in the Caribbean. He is also an honorable associate with universities like the prestigious McGill University in Toronto, in Canada, and also like York University. Currently, he is holding many positions in educational institutes and mosques in Canada and the United States. Today, Dr. Abdullah Hakim will be speaking on Islam in Africa. A part 1, a part 2, there's a prayer in between, the prayer of the Salatul Dhuhr. And then after the Salatul Asr, he is going to start with the deeper roots part. And tomorrow, inshallah, Dr. Abdullah Hakim he will also be speaking on Islam in the Americas and the Caribbean. Without further ado, I would like to ask Dr. Quick to step forward so he can enlighten us with knowledge, inshallah.
Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala jami'al anbiya'i wal mursaleen wa ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa barik wa sallam. All praise are due to Allah, Lord of the worlds, and peace and blessings be upon all of the noble prophets, to Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, and all the righteous ones from the beginning of time. And I begin with the greeting words of Islam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, it is a great privilege for me to be here with you in Amsterdam. And I want to say at the outset, especially for our friends and guests who are here, that our intention is to establish peace, justice, and security. And I want to advise especially to the Muslims here in the Netherlands, and as we are advising all over the Western world, that it is crucial today in the very chaotic, insecure world that we are living in, that Muslims are part of the solution and not the problem. And that we need to work toward the peace, security, the justice of all citizens. Here in the Netherlands, I'm coming from Canada. We have chosen this country, and we need to maintain with the dignity of all of the people living in this land. Alhamdulillah, it is a great opportunity for me to be here, because coming to Amsterdam, to the Netherlands, fits in with part of the international study that I have done concerning the travel of Europeans in the world, and also the results of the colonial period. And this study itself, for me, is not just an intellectual study, but this is part of a life experience that I have been going through. And as a young African American, I consider myself an African American, I looked into my family and realized that we also have roots in Europe and in the native people of America. My grandmother on my father's side was a Mohawk, of what they call the Indians. And so as a young person, I began to question things, question my identity, question my roots, question the information that was being taught. And I realized that in many cases, that information was not necessarily the reality on the ground. And as a young person, I asked the question also about Christopher Columbus, because they said Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492. And my question, like many other people, is how is that possible to discover America when there's 75 million people already living there? Just think about that. So something is wrong. Something is wrong. And in coming into Islam, I encountered the teachings of the last Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. And he was the last of a great line of messengers who came to every nation and every tribe. And in one of his authentic hadith reported in Sahih Muslim and also in the Jamia Saghir Imam al-Suyuti, he is reported to have said, يَكُونُ فِي آخِرِ الزَّمَانِ كَذَّابُونَ دَجَّالٌ يَأْتُونَكُم مِنَ الْأَحَادِيثِ بِمَا لَمْ تَسْمَعُوا أَنْتُمْ وَلَا آبَاؤُكُمْ فَإِيَّاكُمْ وَإِيَّاهُمْ لَا يُضِلُّونَكُمْ وَلَا يُفْتِنُونَكُمْ. The Prophet, peace be upon him, was reported to have said, there will come at the end of time false prophets, great liars, and they will come to you with a type of speech that neither you nor your parents have ever heard of before. Beware of them. Beware that they take you astray, and beware that they put you into a fitna, which is a trial, a tribulation, a gray area, a confusion. And Sadaqa Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam, that time has come to pass. And I sincerely believe that one of the great problems we're facing today is ignorance. It is the ignorance of culture. It is the ignorance of each other. And ignorance breeds fear. And fear makes people do strange types of things. And so our intention with our program in the next few days is to try to break down this ignorance that people have of Islam and of the African continent, and try to bring more light, you could say, into our understanding, with the hope to bring together people of different faiths, and also to clear up to Muslims as well something about our own history. And so this approach is a different approach. And as we say in America, if you really want to know the source, if you really want to understand an issue, we say in America, take it from the horse's mouth. In history circles, they say primary sources. Go to the basis of the issue itself instead of listening to it from somebody else. So I will be speaking to you, in a sense, from a Islamic perspective, in the sense of you're going to hear an approach to history that may be different than what you've been listening to or what you've learned in the educational system. And this is important for us today, to be able to open up our minds, open up our understanding, to break down some of the confusions in the world. Many thinkers today are actually saying that what people are suffering from is what you could call perception deception. That means that our perception of things, we have been deceived. In the same way that we are taught that Christopher Columbus discovered America. Look at the picture. And this is a bit of information which is taught all over the planet. This date of 1492 is a crucial date in the history of the Western world. In the Americas, after the birth of Jesus, Isa alayhi salam, when they go like BC to AD, after that time, this is the most important date in terms of the shift of history. But it's based on something which is not true. Because how can you say you discovered it? Like I would say Abdullah Hakim discovered Amsterdam in 2015 because I just got here. You understand? I would be totally denying the civilization of the people who lived here. And so similarly with Columbus, there were over 75 million people living in the Americas. And further on, inshallah, in the deeper roots, I want to go into this deeper with you to sort of open up the area of understanding. What I want to try to bring to you in the next few hours is sort of an overview. It's a summary of a very big topic. And so it's like a madkhal, it's like an entrance into the topic. And especially for those students of knowledge, this can be a way for you to, like an inspiration, to continue to study and to begin to question information that is given to you. Africa itself is a huge continent. Now, when I was growing up in the Americas, when they spoke about Africa, it was usually negative things. I mean, if I say to you right now, if I say to you sugar, what comes in your mind?
Nigeria.
Sweet. If I say fire, what comes in your mind? Okay, if I say ice, what comes in your mind? Cold. If I say Africa, what comes in your mind? Now be honest to me. Just respond. Poor people, right? What else comes in your mind? Slaves, refugees. And I tried this in school systems, testing it on people and adults as well. And because of the images of the system, again, perception, deception. It's a perception, it's a wrong perception that we are being fed through the educational system and also through the media today. And so I began to search to try to find out what actually happened in Africa. I had the chance to live in Southern Africa, in Cape Town, for 10 years, and to travel all around the southern states and to visit North Africa and in the Sahara Desert, to travel in the Sahara of West Africa, and begin to understand how huge this continent really is. You can fit, geographically, you can fit China and India into Africa. Did you know that? China and India can fit inside of this continent, and there's still space. But what happened is, back in the 17th century or so, Gerhard Mercator, he did a map, the Mercator map, and he literally made Africa small and made the other continents larger. So when you look at most maps, it changes your perception as to what actually the continent is. And the history also, when you think of BC, you generally think of cavemen, right? Before Christ, BC. But the reality is, and I went to Egypt, I went up the Nile and visited Egypt to try to understand the history of early Africa. The reality that I found was that in 3200 BC, that Menes, or Number, he united Upper and Lower Egypt. And Upper Egypt is actually the south. You see the Nile River, it looks like it flows like this. But no, it flows south-north. Because the mountains are in the south, and it flows to the north. And this Egypt was probably the first of the ancient countries to have a united government. And when we really look into the history of the Nile Valley, you can actually go back to around 17,000 BC and find people in settlements organizing themselves, having crops, conquering the river and uniting themselves. So by 3,200 BC, now think how old this is. They unite Upper and Lower Egypt. And during that early time, they build the step pyramid. Now, some of these pictures I have were actually taken before digital technology. Okay, and so, but anyhow, this is the step pyramid. You see how big the people are there? This is built somewhere around 2,700 BC. And it's still there. If you have a national monument in Holland that is like 100 years old, if you have a building 100 years old, right? Or 200 years old, it's a national monument. Think about this. This is built 2,700 BC. Add on 2015. That's like 4,000 years ago. And it's still there. When you look at the Egyptians as well, and their greatest achievement in terms of their building was in the pyramid age between 2635 BC to 2450. This is the Great Pyramid of Giza. Now, this structure is probably the largest structure ever built by humanity. And you're talking way back now again. If you can focus on this picture, you see how this is a man here. You see how big the pyramid is? That is a man. This is the size of it. And that's me standing there, right? So you can actually see how big this stone is. Some of these stones, between 2.5 to 70 tons. The stones were dug in the south, in Aswan, and then carried up the river and put into perfect precision. And what is mind-boggling about this structure is that there's no cement. The stones were cut perfectly to fit into the other stones. Think about our buildings here. We build a building, we have to put cement inside. And we level it to try to make it straight. There's no cement in this. And they were able to put it together on this level. The corners of the Great Pyramids are perfect right angles. All of the elements of geometry, physics, that later on happened in Greece actually had already been developed there. Because if you look at a timeline, and I'm going to give you a lot of information, I'm going over a lot of things with you. And in your notes, which inshallah we're going to give everybody a copy of, that you'll have some of this information. The ancient Egyptians, and again, if you look at the picture of Ramses there, and if you look at the original one of Menes, you'll see this is an African person. This is an African person with a broad nose and tight curly hair. They were the ones that built this. Now remember, perception, deception. Okay? What does racism tell you? What did we say when you say the word Africa? You thought about poor people, right? You thought about slaves, you thought about refugees. These are African people who are building a structure. It's 2,300,000 blocks of granite. There is enough stone, enough granite in this building to build 30 Empire State Buildings. All of the churches and cathedrals in Europe from the time of Christ until now could be built from this one structure. This is African people, right? At that early date, who built this. And so, again, perception, deception. These are the columns. When you go up the Nile, you reach a place of Thebes, and you will see the huge columns. Again, these were built over 1,000 years before the Greek civilization began. Because Greek civilization comes in around 600 BC. This is 1,000 years before that. Look at the size of the columns. This is a person standing there. Look at the size of the columns. So this is a highly advanced civilization. And these are African people. In the early periods of Egypt, there are no conquerors coming in. There are no Greeks, no Romans, no Babylonians. These are African people who built this structure. In Europe, we celebrate, in the UK, the Stonehenge, right? Now compare the Stonehenge to that building. 2,300,000 blocks of granite. You see, perception, deception. Our minds are deceived as to the reality. No doubt today, in many of the African countries, it is confusion. It is the product of colonialism. Society is broken down. People in desperation. But that's not the basis of the society. That's not the basis of the culture or the civilization of the people. And so, what I also found, and this is for the Muslims, is that there was Tawheed in Egypt, in ancient Africa. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Surah An-Nahl, verse 16, وَلَقَدْ بَعَثْنَا فِي كُلِّ أُمَّةٍ رَسُولًا أَنْ يَعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ وَاجْتَنِبُوا الطَّاغُوتَ. And verily we have sent a messenger to every nation that they would worship Allah and avoid false deities. Some of them were guided by Allah, some were established in error. So travel in the earth. Siru fil ard. Travel in the earth and see what was the end of those who denied the truth. You know what I found? Because this is saying that prophets came to early Africa, just like China, India, Europe, to the Americas. Every nation had messengers. I did some research and found that way back in the teachings of Ptahhotep, and Ptahhotep was in the early dynasty around 2388 BC, and in his teachings he said, do not scheme against people. God will punish accordingly. If a man says, I shall live by scheming, he will lack bread for his mouth. People's schemes do not prevail. God's command is what prevails. Therefore, live in the midst of peace. What God gives comes by itself. And you will see in the teachings of Ptahhotep clear Tawheed. Another example of this happened much later on. And this is one of the pharaohs. Akhenaten was his name, and he has the Psalms of Akhenaten. And this is really beautiful. Think of Surah Hujurat in the Quran itself. This is from the Psalms of Akhenaten. In number 9, he says, "How manifold are your works, though hidden from sight, O sole God, beside whom there is none. You created earth according to your desire, you alone. All people, cattle, all kinds of animals, all on earth that walk on legs, and all on high that fly with wings. You set every person in his or her place and satisfy their needs." Al-Razak. All have food, and their time of life is determined. Ajalun Musamma. It's determined. Their tongues differ in speech, and so do their characters. The color of their skins are different also, for you distinguish the people. How excellent are your ways, O Lord of eternity. Look at the Tawhidans. And you will find this in ancient writings. It's a whole study within itself. And I was surprised on the African continent that, in many of the different cultures, there are ways to name the creator of the heavens and the earth. In the Burundi people, they know God or Allah as Imana. In the Akan people of West Africa, he who knows or sees all. The Zulu use the word Umdali, which means the creator. And you will continue to go on, and you will find examples of this all over the African continent. So the misunderstanding is that in ancient Egypt, all of the pharaohs were mushrikeen, polytheists, and shayateen. That's not true. Pharaoh is a title, like king or prime minister. And there were many pharaohs. So there are phases in ancient history of Egypt where there is actually Tawheed. Again, perception, deception. Okay, it is the time of Musa alayhi salam. That's when you see the Pharaoh coming in, probably one of the sons of Ramses, who comes in. Then this is the one that we know in the Quran itself. And so continuing on in the ancient teachings, the Egyptians had also what is called obelisk. You know this structure that stands straight up. All the big capitals of the world have some sort of obelisk. It's like a show of power and strength. You'll see it all over the place. But the largest obelisk in the world is in Ethiopia. It's actually in Ethiopia. Because the ancient Ethiopians, especially in the Aksumite kingdom, they were really strong. And what is important to us is that this leads us into the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. Because these are the people who were ruling at that time. And when I'm speaking about Aksum, it would be right around here, this area right there. That was the Aksumite empire in the 7th century, right? This is the time of the coming of the last prophet, Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. And so this is the side, this is the huge structures they had. They also had heavy technology. You remember the story of the Ethiopian army, right? Abraha. He was coming with elephants. Elephants is like a new type of technology brought into the world. Like in World War I, where tanks came in. And then later helicopter gunships. Now it's drones, right? So these new types of technologies changes warfare throughout history. The elephants, they controlled elephants like no other army in the world. And so this is very significant because this was happening around the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. And in the 5th year after the prophethood began, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who was teaching the belief in one God, that all races, all nationalities should be brothers and sisters. He was giving rights to women. He was freeing the slaves, as we will see later on. He was going against the society itself. And so he was persecuted. And his followers were being tortured. And so it was at this time that he said to them that you should travel. And it's very interesting because the Prophet, peace be upon him, said that if you go to Al-Habasha, Abyssinia, it would be better for you, for in it there is a king who will not tolerate oppression. It is a land of truth. Hiya ardu sidq. That's a deep statement. It is a land of truth. Go until such time as Allah shall relieve you from your distress. And so his companions went across the Red Sea. And this is a very significant point, that they went across the Red Sea, not as Arabs hunting for African slaves, right? As some of the propaganda will tell you. No, they left as refugees. And this is the last prophet of Islam who went into a Christian land. And so the leader of the land, called An-Najashi, his title was An-Najashi, but his name was Ashama. So the same way Pharaoh, their leaders are called An-Najashi. In English we say the Negus. In their language, which is Tigray, they say Nagash. Okay, so the Nagash was Ashama. And Ashama then received the companions of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And the Quraysh, as you know, it's a long story. The Quraysh sent emissaries to bring them back. But Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, radiallahu anh, the brother of Ali, radiallahu anh, he read from Surah Maryam in front of the king. And when Najashi heard this, he cried, and all of the people in his court cried, and they said, stay in our land. There's really no difference between us. And so they stayed within the land of Al-Habasha. It was a sanctuary. So the first entrance of Muslims into the African continent, if we use the Red Sea as a barrier, it's really not, but if we use it as a barrier, then the first entrance is as refugees, and it is a unity between a Muslim prophet and a Christian king. You see this? This is totally different than what you have fed in some of the media and some of the educational systems. And the Prophet ﷺ, he wrote a letter to Najashi. This is a copy of the original letter, which is in the Topkapi Museum in Istanbul. And the Prophet ﷺ wrote him a letter, and he said, from Muhammad, the messenger of Allah, to the great Negus of Abyssinia, peace be upon he who follows the guidance. As to what follows, verily for you I praise Allah, the one whom there is no deity except him, the sole king, the holy, the source of peace, the protector and the guardian. I bear witness that Jesus, the son of Maryam, is the spirit belonging to Allah. Now see how he's speaking to you. I bear witness that Jesus, the son of Maryam, is the spirit belonging to Allah and his word, which he cast into the chaste and excellent virgin. She thus became pregnant by means of his spirit and his inspiration with Jesus, and in the same manner, he created Adam with his hand. Okay, this is a diplomatic letter. This is a letter of believers in God, one to another. Who else believes in the world at that time that Jesus was born with no father? So this is a diplomatic letter, and finally, in the end of it, he says, verily, I invite you to Allah, the one who has no partner, and to friendship, continuity, and government in obedience to him. Thus I have delivered the message and given you counsel, therefore accept my counsel. Peace be upon he who follows the guidance. Now this is a very important letter, because you see what he's saying at the end. He's inviting the Ethiopians and their army to accept Islam. Now just think about the power in the world at the time. Because Abraha's army, their army was irresistible. The Quraysh could not defeat their army. Was only, in our understanding, the power of God who sent birds, Tayran Ababil, right? The birds dropped stones on them from high altitudes, and the Ethiopian army was defeated. If they had accepted Islam, the whole story would have ended right there. Because they would have come back to Mecca as Muslims. And the whole of history would have changed. So this letter is a very important letter. But for us now, and again, this is a very deep topic, the companions stayed there for a period of time. In the last migration, there was 83 men and 19 women. And a number of the Abyssinians accepted Islam. And they eventually migrated to Medina with the rest of the companions. Now, usually, if you talk about Ethiopia, or you talk about people, African Muslims, who do you usually say? What name comes up? African Muslim in the time of the Prophet. Bilal. You say Bilal. Do you know Bilal had a brother? This is new information. Do you know Bilal had a sister? Bilal's brother was named Khalid ibn Rabah. He was one of the early Muslims. His sister Ghafira bint Rabah. They were also part of the companions. And so a number of people from Ethiopia migrated over, and 15 Sahabas were actually buried. They died in Ethiopia, and they're buried in a place called Negash. If you want to see a documentary that I did, I took a film crew in there from South Africa, and we filmed it. So if you go online, put my name in, and then say Untold Ethiopia, then you can download a documentary of my journey to Ethiopia, and you can see the actual place itself. And there are some beautiful things to see. This is the masjid. This is Masjid al-Najashi. And these are the places we need to start visiting, to understand, to open up our understanding of our history. And so in this village here, there is 15 Sahabas who are buried there, and also Najashi himself. And again, this is a part of our history that we're not really aware of. After this time, the Muslims had migrated from Mecca to Yathrib, which became Al-Madinatul Munawwara. That it was lit, the lighted city, lit with taqwa, with iman, with faith, piety. It became a lighted city. And when the message began to spread, and it's so interesting because the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he also recognized people of other faiths. See, there's a difference between the original Islam and what some people practice today. He recognized the Jewish people within that society. The Jewish tribes, Banu Qurayza, Banu Qaynuqa, Banu Nadir, they were recognized and they were put into the constitution as a separate entity within Medina. And they were not compelled to accept Islam. They were not forced to accept Islam. But they were accepted as part of the city, and it was one of the first times in a city-state that the rights of minorities were actually respected and written into the constitution of the city itself. But although the city was lit, other parts of the world did not see it like that. And the Romans, the Byzantine Romans, who were based in Constantinople, they attacked from the north. And so a number of confrontations happened. One in the Prophet's time is Tabuk, although the Romans never came. And after his death, these confrontations continued. And by the mercy of Allah, the Roman army that had oppressed many of the people throughout the Mediterranean, they were defeated. And so the Muslims then began to take back all of the possessions of the Romans. So the warfare that was going on in Syria, it was a response to the Roman attack. Also, the movement of Muslims across North Africa, it was a response to the Byzantine Romans. It is not to spread Islam by the sword. You cannot spread a religion by forcing people to accept it. Again, perception, deception, right? The real reason of the spread is a response to the Romans. So the fighting is a military thing. And it is reported that by 670, Uqba ibn Nafi', rahimahullah, the great Tabi, he rode all the way across until he reached the Atlantic Ocean. And he established the city of Qayrawan. And Qayrawan in Tunisia is an extremely important place. It's a place that we need to be familiar with and to try to understand. And so he establishes Qayrawan. The Muslims went right across North Africa. And by 705, Hassan ibn Nu'man, he founds a city-state there. And at that time, in Tunis, it was called Ifriqiya. Now, this is another interesting point. Because the area of North Africa, Morocco, and that area of Tunis, it was called, they say it was the ancient Greeks or the ancient Phoenicians, Ifriqo. They use this name meaning a warm place. And so when the Arabic-speaking Muslims came, they Arabicized the word. And so it became Ifriqiya. And that was the first time Africa was being used. Africa was not used on the African continent. If you said in those days that you came from South Africa, it meant you came from southern Tunisia. You see the difference now? Perception? Names change. Okay, so this is the first modern usage of the terminology. And the religion is being spread across, and it is not being carried by the military. What is happening is Arabic language is established as a type of lingua franca. It is a language of trade, of scholarship. It's the same way we use, Latin letters, and we speak English now as overcoming everything, right? So we use this language. Arabic at that time was being used by merchants in many parts of the world, and so you see the language starting to spread, and also you see that non-Arabic speaking people are now coming into Islam and learning Arabic. Okay, and so this is the reason why many of the early texts are actually written using the script. And I was surprised to find out on our journeys to Spain that Muslims living in Spain, in Al-Andalus, wrote their many of their correspondences Spanish with Arabic letters. This is Ajabi. It's called Ajabi script. So it's Spanish language, but it's Arabic letters, the same way that Turkish, Urdu, Kiswahili, Malay, in the early days were all written with Arabic letters. Okay? So you find this. So coming across, what we find, when you look at Africa itself, in this early period of time, and we look at the movement of people going across. Now what's important for us, if you look at this map here, this is showing the spread of Islam across. So here is Ifriqiya and Qayrawan. That's the base. And Qayrawan was the capital, the western capital of Islam. It was here that Sahnun and the great scholars put together Al-Mudawwana Al-Kubra, Imam Malik. This is where the Maliki fiqh was put together, there in Qayrawan. And in order to organize the people, the Umayyad dynasty sent a great leader named Musa bin Nusayr. And Musa bin Nusayr, rahimahullah, he dealt with the Berber people, and we like to say Amazigh people. He dealt with them in a different way. He was not harsh. He actually gave upward mobility to the people. And so you find many people from the Amazigh entering into Islam. And one of his great leaders was called Tariq ibn Ziyad. And Tariq ibn Ziyad, rahimahullah, he and Musa bin Nusayr, they responded to a request. Now, if you look at the map here, and you'll see the Iberian Peninsula. It's very close right here. Actually, some geographers consider this to be sort of the same. The Christians who were living in the north, many of them believed in one God. Jewish people had migrated to Spain around 350 BC when Nebuchadnezzar sacked Jerusalem. And so there was an ancient Jewish presence also there in Al-Andalus. Okay? And the people themselves, the Vandals, from their name comes the name of the country itself, Vandalusia. It was Arabicized, Vandalusia, Andalusia, Al-Andalus. So it's the land of the Vandals. This is a Germanic tribe that was living in this area. And they were being crushed by the Pope of Rome. It was a struggle going on. This is a long study. A struggle was going between those who believed in one God and those who believed in a Trinity. So the struggle all throughout the Mediterranean. They called to Musa bin Nusayr. He responded to their call, and Tariq ibn Ziyad went across the straits, and he met an army of over 100,000 Visigoths. Met Tariq ibn Ziyad. He was successful. He defeated them. And in 711, the Muslims began to spread throughout Spain. All of this area here, actually more even to the Pyrenees Mountains, was taken over by the Muslims. And Al-Andalus stayed under Muslim rule for almost 800 years. This is a long period of time. And this is a study that is a very interesting one. And it's one that has a lot of information, the rise and fall of civilization. And it's one that, inshallah, we hope to be able to do with you sometime in the future. What is important for us, however, is what happens on the African continent. We're focusing on this. And now, in 734, the governor of Ifriqiya, he sent out missions across the desert here. They crossed the Sahara. And what they found is that on the other side of the Sahara, there was huge deposits of gold. And these deposits of gold in the Niger River area at that time was probably the largest gold mines in the world at that time. And so trade missions were sent out. And some of the routes that you would take on these trade missions, I want to show you some of the routes itself. One of the routes going across the desert starts in Tripoli, and then it takes you across Ghadames, and then down to Bilma, into a place called Kanem Bornu. So the people in the south here, they were the ones that had the gold, and this is the trade route going. Okay, another trade route takes you across. This one probably started in Iran itself, and it goes to Tahert, and then to Mecca, and down to Gao. The third major trade route starts in Fez to Sijil Masa, and then down into the Empire of Ghana. And this is a place called Kumbi Saleh. And so the trade routes are now moving back and forth across the desert. And it is the Sanhaja, it is the people of the Amazigh, the Sanhaja people who take you across the desert and meet the people in the south. And so what is important for us now in this discussion is the fact that below the Sahara, the empire of Mali develops. Now Islam originally went to the people of West Africa in the 11th century, the Mandinka, people call the Mandinka the Mande nation. They accepted Islam, and one of the great writers, Al-Bakri, he talks about their acceptance of Islam, and then with the gold routes there, they transformed into a major empire. Again, this is where this perception, deception. Okay? One of the great leaders of Mali, his name was Mansa Suleiman. Mansa was their name for king. Mansa Suleiman ruled in Mali from 1337 to 1359. He built masjids, he strengthened the culture. He was visited by Ibn Battuta. You know Ibn Battuta? He's the great traveler from Tanja, and he visited Mali. And when he came to Mali, he said that of all the places he went in the world, it was the most peaceful place he has ever been in. He traveled from one side to another side, and there were no bandits or no criminals. It was a really peaceful place. He said the families were meticulous in the reading of Quran for their children, and they would come out on Fridays. The whole city stops on Friday. He was really impressed with what he found there in Mali. But what is important for us in our understanding was one of the great Mansa. His name was Mansa Musa. Now, Mansa Musa, who was ruling now at this time in around 1324, he decided to make pilgrimage to Mecca. Now, this is a picture, part of a map drawn by a European map maker. Of course, that's probably not how he looked, right? Because he wouldn't have a crown of gold like that on his head, right? But look at the size of the gold that he has in his hand. It's like an orange or something. This is how much gold they have. They did a study recently and you can go online and you'll see it. Who are the richest people in history? And so they tried to look at the richest, and they found out that the richest person in history, pound for pound, was Mansa Musa. He literally had more wealth than any other person ever. Perception, deception. Remember what you thought about with Africa, right? This is Mansa Musa. In 1324, Mansa Musa decided to make pilgrimage to Mecca. He carried with him somewhere between 60 to 72,000 people. They crossed the Sahara Desert. Now imagine this. At that time, he carried with him so much gold that he changed the economy of every country that he reached. He had 15,000 camels laden with gold. Just imagine this. This is what our children should be studying, right? Now, today, we're looking at mutant creatures and watch the X-Men and Star Wars and, things like this, right? That's what our children are into now, the X-Men. Right? These are the stories that they look. These are the stories we're supposed to actually see for them to understand. This is the 14th century. What was the condition of Europe at the time? The 14th century, he travels across with a huge amount of gold, 15,000 camels laden with gold, changing all of the economies, and finally he reaches Egypt. When he reached Egypt, the Mamluks, and we'll talk about that in time of slavery, they were actually ex-slaves who became the leaders of their land. They fell in love with Mansa Musa, and they gave him a Mamluk cavalry to take him to Hajj. This is a great honor, right? When the Mamluks take you somewhere. So they took Mansa Musa to his pilgrimage to Mecca. And when he returned to Cairo, which at that time was the educational, cultural capital of the whole Muslim world, because of the Mongol destruction of Baghdad, Mansa Musa was a very intelligent person. Just like today, if you want to come to the West, you want to go to America, Harvard University, they'll give you a scholarship. If you're intelligent, they'll give you a scholarship. And then they drain your brain in Silicon Valley or in Cape Canaveral, right? And you think that, everything is being done by Americans. Well, what is an American, right? Who are the people who, making it? They are intelligent enough to use their wealth, and they get people from all over the world. Mansa Musa gave scholarships, stipends. He paid people to come back with him. Architects, scholars, engineers. Every place he went to on his journey back, he would build a masjid. And he continued on until he reached a very important city in the desert. This is the city of Timbuktu. And Timbuktu became a great center of knowledge. Now, in my generation, I don't know about your generation, there's a perception-deception problem. If I was to say to you, in my generation, go to Timbuktu. Or like this means go get lost, right? Because Timbuktu is like out in the moon or something like that, right? Timbuktu. We were about to make a film. My producer, a Muslim producer, was coming with me. We made another film of Timbuktu. You can go online and you can get this. Put my name in there online. And then put in Timbuktu, Empire of Knowledge. And inshallah, you can download the documentary. And so, my producer went to Johannesburg, right, in South Africa, and he told his people, we're going to Timbuktu to make a film. They said, no, stop lying to me. He said, no, I'm going to Timbuktu. They said, stop making jokes. He said, I'm going to Timbuktu. They could not believe that there's a place called Timbuktu. Timbuktu, and again, this is another misunderstanding. It was originally began by a woman. Her name was Baktu. And Timbuktu in Amazigh, the Tamashek form of Berber language, right? Tamashek, you know that, huh? Right, Tamashek. I went to Timbuktu. I met the Tawarik. So the people living in the Tawarik, the men cover their face, right? And the women expose their face, and women control all the money. And so the Tawarik would come across the desert, right? And they would carry salt. They would carry leather goods. And the people who were living below the Niger River had gold. And so they say that this was the place on the Niger where the camel met the canoe. And they traded. And so Timbuktu, but the problem was on the Niger River, there were mosquitoes. And the Tuareg were dying from malaria. So Baktu said, no, let's go north. They went north about 12 kilometers. And they made the settlement. And Timbuktu means the well of Baktu. And so they built the settlement there. And people started to go. Of course, it was a trade center at first. And people from many of the nations of West Africa were going there. The Mande people, Saninke people, the Fulani people, the Wangara, Sarakole. So many different nations came into Timbuktu. The Arabic-speaking people, the Tawarik, had different sections. It became a thriving city. And so the people then, it's in the desert. So after gold, the most important possession that you could have in Timbuktu was a book. And in Timbuktu, and this is interesting, by the 12th century, the Sankore University had over 25,000 students in Sankore University. These are African students who are studying not only what you'd call Islamic studies, but they were studying astronomy, mathematics, medicine. There's a great writer in the Tariq al-Sudan, and he talks about his uncle who went for an operation in a city called Jenne, which is close to Timbuktu, and the operation, a cataract eye operation, and it was successful. Think about this in the 12th century. What was the condition of Europe at that time? There was no University of London, no Sorbonne, no Oxford, none of the universities. These are black African students who are on the pinnacle of knowledge at that time. Thousands of books. Every single man, woman, and child in the city was literate. 100% literacy. In every house, there was a Hafiz al-Quran. Somebody who memorized the whole Quran. So this was a very fabled city. And because the explorers were not allowed to come in across the desert, because they wanted it to be primarily for Muslims, they made a joke about it. So they made, go to Timbuktu. So now it becomes a joke. But actually the reality was, this was an amazing city. Now later on, a number of years later, René Callier, the French traveler, he made it there. And this is about around the 18th century or so. By the time he went there, the city had gone down because the trade route changed from across the desert to the oceans. So now you don't have to cross the desert. You could go by sea to the seaports and then do your business there. And so René Callier found the city a dusty city, but up until now, this is a picture of which I took myself, Jingari Bear Mosque, which is Masjid al-Kabir, that is still there in Timbuktu. And what is left of the Sankore Masjid is there. The struggle that is going on now is a struggle against the desert, because the desert, the Sahara, is coming in. And there were thousands of books. The scholars in Timbuktu, they had thousands of books. And during the colonial period, they took their books out of the city and they buried them under the ground. When independence came to Mali, they brought their books out, and now there are libraries that are there which have thousands of books. But the struggle going on now is that the books were being destroyed by the beetles and the termites eating the literature. So what is happening now, the scholars are using digital technology to try to preserve the books. And there's a lot of very interesting things that is coming out of Timbuktu in this amazing land. And so this is the first section in terms of, and I want to, you can also write down questions. Has anybody written down any questions? Because I'm covering a lot of information. As we go along, if you have pieces of paper, you can, write down your questions about some of the things that we have covered in the first part of the lecture. Again, I'm going through this, very quickly in order that we can understand what is going on. Timbuktu, a center of knowledge and a center of learning. Many of the great scholars of West Africa actually studied in Timbuktu. And the surprising thing is, and this is what I want to cover with you, inshallah, tomorrow, is that when African people were taken across the Atlantic to the Americas, that we are now finding in the Americas books, whole of the Quran written from memory. We are seeing writings of people, some of them were scholars who studied in Timbuktu. And their information is now coming up in South America, in the Caribbean, in the United States. Arabic writing, that same Arabic script, which is now coming forth, it is coming in the Americas itself. And so, again, when we look at the early movement of Islam, we see that right from the beginning, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and his companions, they established the belief in one God. They established a society which does not use color as a basis to judge an individual. They established a society to give rights to women, to protect especially young girls from being abused. They bring the whole issue of zakat, and they are under attack. And so when they find themselves in difficulty, where do they end up? In Africa. They cross the Red Sea. And so that really is the entrance of Islam. And really, when you look at the map, you see that there's not really much difference between Africa and Arabia itself. It's just a decision that one side is Asia and one side is Africa. We didn't make that decision. That was made later during the colonial period. And so the movement of Islam north, the movement across North Africa, it is a movement as a response to the Romans, the response to the oppression, not to spread Islam. You cannot spread Islam by force. When it moves in now, it is bringing literacy, it is bringing trade, scholarship, and so the whole emphasis within Islam is to read. The whole emphasis is scholarship. And this is what we find, and this is what, Timbuktu, for us in West Africa, is sort of a pinnacle. It's a height that it reaches, where people are able to have a major impact upon the societies, and the knowledge of Timbuktu is traveled to different parts of the world, and it is still alive today. Okay? Are there any questions so far? If anybody has a question and you wrote it down, raise your hand. We have people who can answer them. Okay. Can you pick up that question from the system? Yeah. Yeah, okay, this is a good question. The letter that was sent by the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, to Najashi, he didn't write it himself. He was actually what we call unlettered. But there was 20 people or so at that time. Arabic at that time, it was an oral culture. So there were about 20 people or so who were doing the writings. And so he dictated the letter. And then the scribe then wrote, and the letters were sent out to the kings of Arabia and then later on to the kings of the world. And so you see the Roman emperor receiving one, the Persian emperor, the Muqit in Egypt, Najashi in Ethiopia. So the kings of the world received the letters. But yes, he is considered, he would be unlettered because they were basically, it was an oral culture. And so it was basically being carried on orally by the people. Okay? Any other questions anybody has written down? That you can just collect some of those questions for the people. Now, what I want to do is, again, we're going over a lot of information. And we will have a handout for you, inshallah, that you can be able to review some of the points. And if there are more questions, we can try to deal with them. But, it's a very broad-based issue and stuff. Yeah, so those books, inshallah, we will. Yeah, it says you draw a line between Islam and the intellectual development of Africa. How far can we actually draw the line? Aren't we ignoring the inherent African cultures that are there? Again, you see, what I want to establish is the fact that Islam itself, again, this is a wrong perception. Islam itself is not an Arabian religion. Islam is the religion of Tawheed, of one God. Prophets and messengers were sent to every nation and every tribe. So the ancient teachers, we can't say for sure they were prophets. But if in ancient Egypt there was somebody teaching the belief in one God, then that person would be a prophet of Islam. So in other words, Islam existed all over the world before the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. It's merely Tawheed. So therefore, in African culture itself, as it was in Arabia and many parts of the world, there were those who believed in one God. There were those who believed in the sun. There were those who believed in many different gods. Those who believe in ancestors. And so there are different forms of worship that are happening according to people's understanding and what information came from. So Africa was similar to that. So in terms of African intellectual development, again, it is moving on. Africa is a big place. And there are a number of different perceptions and a number of different ways of approaching religion. Okay. Also, another question is, do these African countries educate about their people, about their own history nowadays? Nowadays, okay, there are a lot of conflicts going on. Nowadays, what is happening now in many parts of Africa and the world is that people are coming out of a colonial system. So therefore, much of what you study here is also being taught in other languages in other parts of the world. And so the educational systems are actually going through changes themselves now, where the people are now expressing themselves in history, expressing themselves, in their own, national consciousness. And so this is something which is developing in Africa and other parts of the world, but, it will actually take time to develop. Okay? Now, there is some discussion about Akhenaten, that he worshipped the sun god. But when you read the Psalms, there's a difference of opinion among scholars. There are some who believe that you see in his writings that he's not always talking about the sun, he's talking about the power behind the sun. The sun was a manifestation, but he was talking about the power behind the sun. And if you read the Psalms of Akhenaten, then you actually see this understanding of the power, of the creator, and not necessarily the sun itself as the creator. Okay? So we're going to end here now, the first period, and then inshallah we'll come back later on as we continue. Billahi. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. So as we continue in our study of Islam in Africa, we want to make a shift into the eastern side of Africa. Of course, Africa is a huge continent that cannot be really dealt with unless you have a long period of time. And what we're looking at are really highlights. It's highlights just to give you a feel of the study itself. And the eastern side of Africa is very interesting because if you look at the map, here is Arabia and Mecca and Medina. Really, when you look at the relationship of Arabia to Africa, it is really part of the same continent. And it was a continental divide that happened that split this off. So it was really later on a European map maker who said that this is Asia and that's Africa. But really the people on both sides of the Red Sea here are very similar. And if you're in Djibouti, which is here, on a clear day, you can see Yemen. Like those of you who have been in Spain, I recently was in Tarifa and Al Jazeera. If you're in Al Jazeera and you look across, you see Al Maghrib. If it's a clear day, right? So you can literally see across to Arabia. That's how close this area is. So to say that this is Africa and that's Asia doesn't really do justice to the culture of the people. So when the companions of the Prophet ﷺ now migrated in the Hijrah into the Aksumite Empire, this is the first contact. And again, to understand this properly, according to our sources, Najashi himself, Ashama, the emperor of Ethiopia, privately accepted Islam. And what was going on in Ethiopia at the time was a struggle between Unitarian Christianity and Trinitarian. Now, this is a deep study. You need to go back to the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. This is when Constantine, the Roman emperor, organized Christendom. Christendom was divided into many different groups. There were those who believed in one God, the followers of Arius, who was a Libyan bishop based in Alexandria. There were those who believed in a Trinity concept that came from Plato, and it was in ancient Egypt as well. There were those who believed in a mixture with Greek and Roman gods. So there were many different forms. Constantine organized, and he had all of the bishops together in a conference called the Council of Nicaea, 325 AD. They finally decided to choose the Trinity as the official position of the church. And anybody who disagreed would be executed. So Arius was executed, and over 100,000 of his followers were killed. And so a struggle was going on. Up the Nile, one of the companions or disciples, Mark, of Jesus, he actually died on the Nile. And so Christianity went up the Nile to Ethiopia very early. And what was happening in the time of Najashi is an internal struggle going on. So Najashi received the letter, he embraced Islam, and a struggle was going on. A revolution came against him. And he told the companions, you should leave. And they waited in boats. And it's an interesting story because they sent Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, great master of Quran, to go over the hill and see what happened to Najashi. And sure enough, Najashi was victorious. So he told them, return. They stayed in Ethiopia until finally the major hijrah was called. And then they left and they went to Medina. And so some of the Abyssinian male companions, some of the names you get like Abu Bakr al-Habashi, Shukran al-Habashi, Dhu Mahma, Dhu Mahdam, Dhu Manahib, of course Khalid ibn al-Hawari, Khalid ibn Rabah, Aslam, Sa, Yasa. There's a number of names that are actually there. But because people in those days did not necessarily want to emphasize race, race has become so important to us today. But they did not necessarily emphasize race there at that time. These companions were amongst the people of Medina, and everybody was intermarrying and blending together at that time. Female companions was Saira and Habiba and Nabha And a number of Ethiopian women also were part of the companions of the Prophet. So they say that 32 Ethiopians migrated to Medina along with the other companions who went. And so when we look at East Africa itself, we need to go back to the time after Najashi, of course, when Najashi passed away. Okay, this is an important point. When he passed away, the Prophet ﷺ was informed about this through the angel Jibreel, and he lined up his companions and he said, we need to make janazah, one of our brothers has died. And so he made a salatul janazah lil ghaib. This is a funeral prayer for an absent person. That was the first time. And so this was, our proof. It is clearly agreed upon by all of the scholars that Najashi had actually embraced Islam. But Islam did not necessarily spread through Ethiopia itself. But the Prophet ﷺ did say, because he did respect the Ethiopians, and he told his companions, Utrukul Habasha ma tarakukum. Leave Al-Habasha. As long as they leave you alone, do not bother the people of Al-Habasha. And it was in the time of Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu that some delegations were sent to Al-Habasha for dawah purposes in order to spread Islam. But there was a terrible accident at sea, and many of them died at sea. And it's not really until later that you start to see people coming in, especially 100 years later. Some say that even during the fitna, when the struggle was going on between Ali and Muawiyah, that some of the ashraf, some of the companions of the family of the Prophet ﷺ went south. And from that time, they left out of it. But especially we see 100 years after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, then we see the ashraf moving down into Hadramaut, in southern Arabia, in Hadramaut area, and Yemen. And then some of them were actually going across to the Dahlak Islands. And there's a place in what is now northern Somalia called Somaliland, a place called Zela. And so it is there in Zela and this area that the ashraf, these are people who are, from the family of the Prophet ﷺ. They landed in Zela, in this area. And then from there, they went up into the higher areas of Ethiopia. Now, when you're in Eritrea, on the coastline, let me go back to the map. Yeah. When you're here, the coastline of Ethiopia is Eritrea. So as you go in the interior, you're going up. Because Ethiopia is very, very mountainous. And so you go to a place called Aksum. This is the center of the Aksumite dynasty. And so it is there in that area, going up into the mountainous areas, that the ashraf then settled into this area. So what is important is that this East African area, this would be Habasha, and this is the Horn of Africa, which is now known as Somalia, and then your East African coastline going down here. So this is what we're calling East Africa, this whole region there. Okay? And so this is an old history. And that's something that a lot of Muslims are not aware of. That the people who coming out of Ethiopia and coming out of Somalia and that region there actually date back early periods to the Umayyad period. And they embraced Islam very early. And they had been in touch with Yemen and in touch with Islam from a very early period. So the Ashraf then went into the mountains, and they settled in a town called Hara. And this was part of the trade network. Now, to understand the trade network properly of East Africa, we have to realize that people were trading along the Red Sea from ancient times. And even the ancient Greeks wrote about the trade that was going there to that area. Because you remember, I have to go back again to this map. You remember the trade, which is so important. This is the trade from southern Arabia here. There is a substance that it comes out of the tree called frankincense. In Canada, we have maple syrup. Do you have maple syrup here in the Netherlands? Okay, we're famous for this maple tree. And so it's like a syrup that drips out. And very sweet and very nice. There's also trees in southern Arabia where this sticky solution drips out and it gets hard, and it's incense. So the frankincense was the first international form of incense. And you take this and you burn it, and it cleans your air. And so it was a prized substance. And the ancient Greeks and Romans and the Persians, in their temples and in the houses of their aristocrats, they used this frankincense. So the trade route was going here, southern Arabia, and then it goes north. Rihlat al-Shita'i was safe. The journeys of the north, up to Gaza, in this area, and then down. This is the trade route that was going on. Okay? So it's the people here. Also, the trade was going across here into Yemen. So these areas are very much connected together, and it explains, the importance. So therefore, the area there was actually a very wealthy area at that time because of the trade that was going on. And the Greeks, the Romans, they called the East African coast Azania. That was a Roman name. And but it was later on now that the Islamic history comes in. So this trade route was ancient. It's not a new thing that Muslims began. The boats were going along the Red Sea, trading here, and then going down. And if you take the current will take you here across into the Indian Ocean. And from there, you can take the currents into the South China Sea, and it will take you all the way up into Korea and Japan. And there are reports of Arab merchants long before the time of the Prophet ﷺ who made it to Japan and Korea. They were trading from the ancient times. And this is important, again, to establish our ability on the ocean, that we had great abilities on the sea. And so this trade is a very important trade that was going on in East Africa, and it forms the basis of the Islamic civilization that is there. And you'll see it in the culture of the people in Yemen and in Somalia and there in East Africa. And so they were trading for gold, ostrich feathers, different special products coming out of there. And they entered into an area, the Ashraf, entered into a very mysterious city. And for those of you who are interested in special information about Africa, it is the city called Hara. It is a mysterious city. And it was a city of scholars and illuminaries. And for hundreds of years, it became the center of spirituality in East Africa, where the great du'at would leave, and scholars, and a number of people would come from the city of Hara. We actually went there to study the walls. Up until now, it's a walled city. It's a very interesting place. And if you go online, to my documentary, Untold Ethiopia, you will see a discussion concerning, the walled city there in Hara. And in the city of Hara, they actually had what is called the Ahli system. And Hara is a very important city. They claim that they have more masjids per square meter than anywhere in the world, or in the city of Hara. See, again, this is knowledge that we're not aware of. But if you go in Ethiopia, it is well known. And it has 82 masjids within a circumference of about 3,348 meters. So there's masjids all over the place. And they would establish a masjid according to every 40 families. because they were Shafi'i in fiqh. And according to the fiqh of Imam Shafi, that if you want to establish Jumu'ah Salat, you need to have 40, adult males to establish the Jamia. Masjid, so what they would do there is that every time you had 40 families in the area, then they would establish a masjid. And they developed what is called the Ahli system. It's a beautiful system because each masjid has an imam, and all of the imams in the city would meet along with the Amir. So monthly or so they would have a meeting. And if you had a problem in the western side of the city, then you take it to the Majlis al-Shura, and the Amir is there, and it's discussed by everybody in the city. So this is like democracy, right? This is real. This is not Donald Trump. This is real democracy. Where the people actually, you don't pay your way in. You represent your people. That's what democracy is originally supposed to be. You represent the people of your area, and you represent yourself to the leadership. And if you have a problem, it's known by everybody in the city. Also, what is important about the Ahli system is that for the 40 families in the masjid area and the imam, they take care of each other. Ahli is like family. And so if somebody is sick, the people in the masjid visit their home. If there is a fire, everybody builds the home back. And that's important because some of our masjids today are only places to make salat, and then, Assalamu alaikum, I'll see you next Friday. They don't come back again. But, okay, what about your brother and sister? How is the health of the other Muslims? Does somebody need economic help? That's what the ummah is supposed to be, a family. And so they established this in this area. Very interesting. Also, something happened in that area. Some of the shepherds were out with their flocks. They say it was in the mountains around Hara. And at nighttime, they would get up and they would see the goats and the sheep jumping around, like wide awake. And they said, like, why are they awake? And they found there was a berry that they were eating. So they took the berry and they boiled it and they tried drinking it themselves, and it actually woke them up. And so they cultured this, and then in the trade with Yemen, went over to Yemen, and that is the first coffee. That is where coffee began. And coffee is now an international drink. Coffee is so important to people. I don't know, here it is. It's a little different in Europe than in America, right? We have Starbucks, Dunkin' Donuts. Canadians have a thing called Tim Hortons. And they say coffee is now the most drunk. People drink it more than any other drink. Is that the same here in the Netherlands? Yes. Like everybody's drinking coffee. Coffee at one point was an Islamic drink. Only Muslims were drinking coffee. Okay, other people were drinking tea and other things. It was from Yemen where you get coffee Arabica, and then it was the Ottoman Turks who made it international. Now Donald Trump is drinking his Starbucks. And saying Muslims, cannot, we want to kick them all out of America. He's drinking a Muslim drink. You see, perception, deception. People are deceived as the actual reality of how close we are as a human race and how we actually interchange culture, and knowledge between ourselves. So this city of Hara was a great city. If you ever get a chance to visit Ethiopia, it is something which is worth visiting. And they actually have in Hara museums as well. Thousands of books are brought together in a museum, just like Timbuktu. And when Richard Burton, a European explorer, visited there, he called it the Timbuktu of the East, because it's something very similar in Hara. Okay, so you now have the relationship, in East Africa, first the Ethiopians, and then in Somaliland, and then it is going up. And now another group comes in. And this is the Swahili people. And this is another very important group of Muslims that many Muslims from other parts are not aware of. The concept is that as the boats were moving along East Africa, the merchants settled on the coast and they married into the Bantu nations of East Africa. And so the descendants of the Arab and Bantu people became what is known as the Swahili people. And the name Swahili comes from Arabic Sahil or Sawahil, right? Which means the coastline. So Swahili is the language of the people of the coast. That's literally what it is. And if you look at Swahili, it's got Arabic vocabularies, but the grammar is Bantu. So it's a combination of the two that you get. So similarly, the nation was actually a combination. And so the Swahili culture then develops all along the coastlines there. And for those of you who want to do research, in our own primary sources, there's a chronicle called the Chronicle of Lamu and the Chronicle of Kilwa. And also a great geographer, Al-Mas'udi, in his book called Muruj al-Dahab, and we'll be looking at that in deeper roots. He also journeyed to this place, and in what is now Tanzania, a city called Kilwa. And he found there was great ulama that are there, great scholars, highly cultured, civilized place. This is part of our culture, which is not so well known to people of the Western world. And so the Swahili culture develops all along the coastline there. And it's important to understand that in the development of this Swahili culture, the basic trade that was going on was not slaves. You see that the perception, deception, is that Arabs went to East Africa to get African slaves. And you'll see this being used, this is a propaganda over and over and over again. Slavery in Africa, slavery in Africa. The original trade there in East Africa was not for slaves. It was gold. Because gold was discovered by the people in Zimbabwe. And then later on, of course, in South Africa, these later on become some of the greatest gold mines in the world up until today. And so the gold coming out of Zimbabwe and the ostrich feathers and other things, these were being traded. The slaves, as in other parts of the world, they were carrying the goods. That's how it was all over the world, as we're going to look at tomorrow, inshallah. They were not the goods. It wasn't until the Portuguese came, right, that it all changed. But at that time, the trade took them from the coastlines to the interior. And so Al-Mas'udi, the famous geographer, he writes about Arab merchants who leave the coast of northern Mozambique, right? And they're trading for gold, and they go into the interior. Now, Mozambique comes from Musa ibn Baig, right? Musa ibn Baig, Mozambique. And Sofala, which is on the coastline, some say it could come from an Omani term. It's like Sufla. Out of the Sufla, it's like the lower land, right? So they get Sofala coming out of that. Some people say it may have come from Yusuf Ali. Okay, but it definitely had an Islamic root. Sofala was one of the important things. So what was happening is that the Swahili merchants were going into the interior, and they were trading for the gold and coming back to the coastlines. And so by this route, a number of groups embraced Islam, especially in the area of Zimbabwe, the Vatsonga, Wakarenga, and Waremba. The Waremba people are still actually there in Zimbabwe, in that area. They can trace their roots actually back to Muslims. It's in their language. They say it's even in the DNA now. They're doing DNA studies. Where it's actually coming out. And so the trade centers were set up along the rivers, the Zambezi River, and a number of these going into the Zimbabwe plateau. And they were trading. We also found in a country called Malawi, in Malawi, taking other routes along the rivers the merchants were going into Malawi, and they were also trading with the people, and a number of people embraced Islam. Some of these same Arab merchants, Swahili merchants, made it into Uganda. And when they reached Uganda, there were a number, and they had a really good relationship with the people. And there, in the city of Kampala itself, is a number of hills, and it is the kings of the Buganda people. Different princes control the hills. One of the princes wanted to embrace Islam, but according to the Uganda belief, you cannot shed the blood of a ruler intentionally. He cannot shed his own blood intentionally. And this is a problem because, for the males accepting Islam, there's circumcision, right? So there's going to be some bloodshed, right? See the brothers cringing, right? There's going to be some bloodshed going on there. So he decided, I'm going to accept Islam. So he embraced Islam, and up until now, one of the hills in Kampala is where the Muslims are there, that the Jamia Masjid is there. And so all over East Africa, in this region, Islam was spreading there. And again, this is long before the slave trade. Now, this is an important thing for, our perceptions. Okay? Because later on, the Portuguese came in. This is now the 15th century. And this is Vasco da Gama. And they also say that da Gama, he discovered the way around the Cape of Good Hope. Right? As though nobody was living there before. Right? And what is the Cape of Good Hope? What are you hoping for? They were trying to find a trade route to go around the center of Islam to reach India and China. They didn't want to go through where the Turkish people were and along. They didn't want to go through there. So this is good hope to go around. And it was a Muslim, Ahmed bin Majid, who actually led Da Gama around. And he was an Omani. And so Da Gama went around and he reached the coastline there in East Africa. Then he went over to India, and you have the city of Goa in India where the Portuguese, right? So you'll see what they did. So now when the Portuguese came in, it was a different concept altogether. And they were actually looking for slaves, where the slaves becomes the merchandise. So a combined effort of the Swahilis and the Omanis. So the Omanis now come in, and they defeat the Portuguese. Okay? Now, this is where, and we'll be going more into details about this tomorrow, and it's important for us to, be very clear about this, that it was in the 17th century the Portuguese were defeated. But the Omanis, when they saw the wealth that the Portuguese were gaining, many of them, they became greedy themselves, and they got involved in the slave trade. So they made Zanzibar as their capital, and they had plantations there and whatever. But if you look at the time period, it's only really 1840, from that time, that the Omanis controlled the east coast of Africa. Okay, so from 1840 until like not even 100 years or so, they were eventually defeated. This is not a 1,000-year period of slave trade. That's an exaggeration. Again, that's perception, deception. See, it's a reality. There was slave trade, but it was not the same as the Atlantic slave trade. The volume was not the same, right? And we're going to talk in more details concerning how that actually happened. But it did happen. And we have to recognize the fact that the Omanis were wrong in what they did. And we will be explaining more, inshallah, about this area and about the trade that went on there. Now, in the Western Cape, in Southern Africa itself, and again, this route, the cultural route of the trade, it goes down Mozambique, Musa I, and then down here. On this side is the Western Cape. Okay, so this is your Cape of Good Hope, where Da Gama went. And so So this is a trade route. So now it was Ahmed bin Majid from Oman, that some consider him to be a munafiq, like a hypocrite, but took the Gama around. They knew, the Omanis, the Arabs knew the trade routes. They knew the routes, how to go follow the currents and to travel around here. Because the wind is very strong in the Cape of Good Hope. Very strong. So unless you know how to maneuver, it's difficult. So he helped them to maneuver and then reach the coastline ports there along in this area. Okay, and then out into the sea. Now, what is important for us is that in the Western Cape, and it was in the Western Cape in the 17th century that it was the Dutch who had conquered during the colonial period much of in places in Indonesia and areas there. The Dutch settled down in the Western Cape, and they made Cape Town as sort of the capital there in that part of Africa. And the first reports go back to 1652. And it was around that time that they were capturing slaves, political prisoners from India, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Indonesia, Madagascar, East Africa, West Africa, and they were bringing them in. Cape Town was a key point for them on their international trade route. And so a Muslim community, this is a artist's conception of the early Cape Muslims. And I had the opportunity to live in Cape Town, actually for 10 years. This is a unique Muslim community that most people are unaware of, how deep the history is in this part. And so it was in this area of Cape Town that a great leader was brought, a resistance leader and a great scholar. And this is Shaykh Yusuf of Makassar. And so it's around 1626. This is his time, 1699. He was a scholar. He studied in Mecca. And he went back to Indonesia. And he resisted the colonial rule. And he struggled for about 20 years. Finally, his people were defeated. And he was taken as a political prisoner. He went into exile. And he had about 49 followers with him. They first went to Sri Lanka. And then every place he went, there was a revolution. And so they took him as far away as they possibly could in their colonies in Africa. Of course, the furthest place is Suriname, right? If the Dutch want to take you far away, they're going to take you to Suriname, right? No offense to the Surinamese, right? I have West Indian roots too, Barbados. But if they want to take you there, they're going to take you to Suriname. Okay? The furthest place in Africa you could go would be Cape Town. And so Shaykh Yusuf, rahimahullah, with his family and 49 followers, they were brought to the Cape, and they developed a community on the Erst River, and they were specialized in the recitation of Quran, in tafsir, in Islamic knowledge, and they developed a scholarly community, which still continues up until today. It's an amazing thing. And so up until today, this community is there, and this is an artist's conception of Shaykh Yusuf. And there in Cape Town, a number of things were going on. And even before the emancipation of the slaves in 1834, a masjid was built in Cape Town called AboAliMosa I, right, the first masjid. And one of the great imams, Abdullah Qadi Abdul Salam, he was a great leader, and he wrote the Quran from his memory. And this is the actual picture of the Quran, which still is in the masjid itself in Cape Town. If you go to AboAliMosa, then you see his original Quran, which was written from memory. He was known as Tuan Guru, and he struggled against the colonialism and the slavery, and he was banished to Robben Island. Now, do you remember, President Nelson Mandela? Right, so Mandela was banished to Robben Island with the ANC. Long before Mandela, there were Muslims also who resisted the apartheid system. And the Qadi Abdul Salam, he was taken there to the Robben Island. And it is here that he wrote a number of books in Islamic jurisprudence. And I was surprised to actually find out that Afrikaans language, which is the language spoken in South Africa, which is mostly Dutch. Afrikaans is a mixture of Dutch and Malay, and it's got other languages as well. But Afrikaans was first written in Arabic script. That was the first writing of Afrikaans. And when the president of Mali visited South Africa, and he said, I have documents from Timbuktu. This is our national documents written in Arabic language. The president of South Africa brought documents, Afrikaans, written in Arabic script. That's Ajami. And it is the works of this great scholar. The first one is on Aqidah. It's a book of Tawheed. And it's in Afrikaans language with the Arabic script. That's the first writing of the Afrikaans language itself. Very interesting point. And the Cape Townian Muslims were actually very influential within the society. And in the struggle against apartheid, they were very much involved with Nelson Mandela, and the ANC, and very much involved when he was underground. They were putting him in their homes. Also, Indian Muslims from Johannesburg and Durban as well were involved in the struggle. And so they made a very important contribution to the society there in the southern part of Africa. And so if you go to southern Africa, you will find Muslims in Zimbabwe, in Malawi. In Mozambique, they say that the majority of people in Mozambique are Muslims. They are the majority. And so you'll find that all over the southern region, it's not so well known and documented, but this is a very important part of our understanding of Africa. So this is the East African, understanding going down into South Africa. So just a few points in review. I want to just go over with you. Number one, and these are some lessons that we've taken from this, that Africa really is a diverse continent. It cannot be defined on a narrow basis. If you really want to understand Africa, you need to see different nations and different types. Even racially, when you think of Africa, and I recommended a book to you, it'll be in your notes. It's by a great scholar named Dr. AboAliMosa I, who was a great Kenyan scholar. Africa, a triple heritage. And he said, when they want to define what is an African, there's a stereotypical, look of an African. But it's a problem in Africa because you have all types. Lighter skin, darker skin, straight hair, curly hair, all types in Africa. It's a blending of people. It's a huge continent. So we cannot put it into one little stereotypical area. We have to understand the diversity in the African continent itself, especially for Muslims. And we're focusing on Muslims here, but Muslims can benefit from this as well because, I could say to you that there are more Arabic-speaking people in Africa than in the Middle East. You ever heard of anything like this before? Because if you include Egypt, right, and right across, that's Africa, right? The population of Egypt, and going right across, you actually have a larger number. So it's not separated from the so-called Middle East. This is a Eurocentric way of looking at things. You're centering yourself in Europe. And our way with thinking has to change. Okay, especially to understand Africa and to understand our faith itself. Number two, history should be told from all perspectives, not just the perspective of the rulers, the victors. This is a struggle going on in historical circles now. how do we teach history? There is a history of people who are poor. There are a history of all types of people. And that needs to be understood. And that would take us into what I call not his story, it is our story. You understand the difference in the two? History, his story. Like for most of you, history was probably your worst subject, right? Many of you, right? Many students I found out they didn't like history. Why? Because it's a boring subject. If it's taught the wrong way, if I took a picture of you right now, this whole room, who is the first person you would look at in the picture? Yourself. You want to see if your eyes are closed, or, if you look nice, whatever the picture. So if you're studying history and you're not in the book, it's not about you, then you're going to get bored. So what we're talking about is not his story, we're talking about our story. And that is not to take out European history, no. But give things the proper perspective. That's all we want. Put things in the proper place. Number 3, ancient Africa was a land of high civilization and advanced technology. And the further you go back, before Christ, BC, is the larger the buildings are. So the buildings are amazing when you go back to like 2500 BC. But there was a racist historian who came along, and he said, I'll solve the problem. Africans couldn't have built this thing. It was aliens who flew down from outer space, built the pyramids, and then flew back up. Have you ever heard of that before? They even have a movie they call Stargate. Right, so the aliens came down and built. How could Africans build something like this? Like, that doesn't make sense if you have a racist concept, right? It can't make sense. Because the Greeks were the first to have civilization. And when the Olympics were in Athens, were in Greece, a number of years ago, and they had the parade at the beginning, the Greeks said, we started geometry, we started physics, philosophy, everything. Wait a minute, man. Greek civilization comes in 600 BC. I want you to think about this. 600 BC is when the city-states of Greece came together and began. 2,000 years before that time, the Egyptians had built structures, the largest structures ever built. Africans had built it. The ancient Greeks were not racist. They were not racist people. The ancient Greeks, in their writings, they said, we got our history, we got our culture from the ancient Egyptians and the Phoenicians. This would be in Lebanon. We got our culture from there. And the ancient Egyptians were dark-skinned people with woolly hair. That's how they described them. And they said, our culture comes from them. Our science. They admitted it. And it's very clear, like I say, in the Great Pyramid, the corner is a right angle. All of the elements of math, all of the technology is inside of these buildings. So unless you believe that aliens did it, then you have to admit it was Africans, right? But that's hard for somebody who's got a racist concept. It's hard to admit these things. Next point. Early Africans worshipped one supreme deity as well as ancestors and created things. So in other words, in ancient Africa, as in other parts of the world, there were those who believed one God, those who worshipped the sun god, and those who worshipped ancestors. All types of beliefs existed in ancient Africa. Next point. Islam has always been connected with Africa, and Tawheed has always been an important part of African thought. Okay, this is a statement. It's always been connected there. And you can go back and look at, even in terms of Ibrahim alayhi salam, right? He went there into Egypt, And they were given a servant, who some say was a princess, named Hajar, or Hagar, may Allah be pleased with her. According to the Bible itself, Sarah could not have children. So she said to Abraham, take Hajar as your wife. So he took her as a wife, and she conceived Ishmael. That is the first son of Abraham. She's an African woman. So from the ancient times, even in Islamic teachings, there's no separation of Africa from Arabia. Right? It's all part of, it's always been connected to Tawheed, even before the so-called Semitic prophets. Tawheed has actually existed. The next point, the first contact. First contact with Africa in the time of the last Prophet Muhammad was the first hijrah. Muslims entered Africa not as slave raiders, not as conquerors, but as refugees, running from persecution. This is a key point of perception, deception that has gone on. That is how Islam entered Africa. And it's interesting that early African Christian leaders stood together with Muslims against polytheism. They stood together. It was a unity between Christian and Muslim. It's a very important point. Breaks down the stereotypes in terms of Islam and the African continent. The next point is that the spread of Islam itself throughout the continent, it was primarily by merchants, mystics, pious people. This is the basis of the spread of Islam. Not the curved sword, the propaganda, accept Islam or I'll chop off your head. This is propaganda. You cannot force people to accept any religion and then they stay in that religion for so long, all across North Africa. Why? Because it was Arius' teachings, who was a Libyan. All across North Africa, the people believed in one God. They refused to accept Constantine. And so when Islam came, it was easy for them to embrace Islam. And that's the reason why they stayed in Islam up until today. The vast majority there in North Africa are Muslims. The next point is the Islamic empires of West Africa were highly developed and they were complex societies. Some maps of the Muslim world even stop at the Sahara Desert. That's a mistake. Below the Sahara Desert, there are complex Islamic societies. And there's a lot to learn from the societies there in West Africa. The next point is that great scholars and leaders appeared throughout the history of Islam in Africa. Great ulama are there. Cities like Timbuktu, Harar, Marrakesh, Fez, Jenne, Kilwa, Mombasa, and other great Islamic cities. They were centers of learning, centers of trade. And this, broadens our understanding of Islam. It broadens, our connection with Muslims from other parts of the world. Next point is that Islam spread throughout the continent primarily through contact made by merchants, mystics. We mentioned this point. Following this, East African Islamic experience was not based on slavery and oppression, but it was developed a symbiotic relationship of merchant and coastal inland people. In other words, they depended upon each other. That's how Swahili culture develops. And if you see Swahili food, Swahili dress, it's a blending of African Arab culture. That's how Swahili culture developed. It's only later on that it actually morphs and changes into something else. Okay, with the Omani, presence, there is some problem. But Swahili Arab Muslims were part of Southern Africa, African society, long before European colonialism. Okay, so these are some lessons that we learned from Islam in Africa. This is a madkhal, this is an entrance into the subject. And you know, it is a very important subject for us. There are many people maybe here who come from North Africa, but we also need to expand our mind to East Africa, right? And to what is beyond the Sahara, on the other side of the desert. What was it that they found there? Why did Abdullah ibn Yasin, rahimullah, the founder of the Murabitun, right, when he went into the area of the Sanhaja, of the Sus region of Al-Maghrib, to teach them about the deen, and they drove him out, he didn't go back, he went south. He went to Senegal, and there he formed the Ribat. And that's where the message of the Murabitun began. Down in the Ribat, by the Niger River. Okay, that's the connection. Why is it that Abu Bakr ibn Umar al-Lamtuni, rahimahullah, the next great leader of the Murabitun, why is it that he left his leadership and he went south? And he and the Murabitun went right across West Africa, not conquering, spreading Islam. Thousands of people embraced Islam at the hands of Abu Bakr ibn Umar al-Lamtuni. Thousands had embraced Islam. That's the connection. And to know what is below the Sahara in that region expands our understanding of Islam, and it breaks down stereotypes that are there. There are certain references that I'm going to give you on your notes. There are certain books you can go into. Some of them are, you know, typical university books. But other ones are specialized texts. And inshallah, in your notes, which our brothers are preparing for you, brothers and sisters, you should be able to get these references, inshallah, to give you more of the history of Islam in Africa. So I want to close with this point, and then we will be continuing on later. Billahi tawfiq. Yeah, so the ones who are asking about books, I'm leaving some references for you that will be there in your notes. It says, you say that people are ignorant of their history, which breeds fear. Isn't it so that Western know their history somewhat, but they just don't care, as it isn't important to them? You know, people do care, but people are unfortunately very impressionable. Most people just follow what is given to them. And right now, the major teacher in society is the media. The movies, the television programs. This is how people are learning. And more people are depending upon YouTube than they are upon reading books and traveling, right? That's how it was before. You wanted to get knowledge, you will read the text, you will travel. You know, but now the emphasis coming out of the media, as I was saying, is a sort of fantastic world where we are more involved. And you can ask some of our young people, you know, who are the X-Men? Mutant creatures. What is their history? The same way we used to know the story of the ulama and the Sahaba, right? They can tell you all football players, right? So what is your football player, your hero? Where did he go to school? How tall is he? What does he weigh? How many goals did he get? It's like how we used to talk about the Sahaba, right? So it's sort of like, you know, covers over. And this is how there is perception, deception. Because then we are given a false history and we lose interest. For somebody interested in African Islamic history, where would you recommend that a person should start their studies? Where to begin? You know, there's a number of, you know, really the study starts within ourselves. And but I would say that Dr. Ali Mazrui, I mentioned his name here on the tape, on the one before. Here he is. Ali Mazrui, The Africans, A Triple Heritage. This is an excellent work. He is one of the great scholars who was able to combine knowledge. He was in Binghamton University in the United States for a long time. He's actually from Mombasa. He's Swahili man, and one of the great scholars of our time. So his works are excellent in terms of a place to start to really understand our history. Okay. And so I thought the first university in the world was Al-Qayrawan in Fez. Is Sankore University founded? No, Sankore University is not before Al-Qayrawan. I didn't say it was the first. But it is a great university. And it's actually connected to Qarawiyyin. It's connected to Qarawiyyin because the scholars in Timbuktu were Maliki in fiqh, and very similar. They specialize in fiqh. Okay, so it is connected with Qarawiyyin. Even the concept of Qarawiyyin being the first university can be challenged because there were actually universities in ancient Egypt. Very complex universities that is there. But, for the modern world that we know, Qarawiyyin takes it back. So it is, Sankore is connected to it. It's part of the, route that the scholars were traveling across the desert. Okay? Yeah, the next one is where the pyramid, were they not built by slaves? Now this is an interesting point, because what they tried to say is that it is slaves. And I was thinking this myself when I went to the pyramids. But then I went inside a tunnel and it had huge bricks. Now, how could a slave put that in place? You're going to put it on his head and walk and carry the thing? 70 tons. It's not possible. This is physics. This is a high level of science. And some of the stories, or some of the reports coming in, is a person named Dr. Ivan van Sertima, who has written about ancient Egypt. Show that for many people in Egypt, it was like what they call national service. It was not necessarily slavery, it was national service, right? That everybody had to put in some time to build, this temple. And the temple itself was not necessarily just a monument. It was a work of practical science. You have theoretical and you have practical math and science. And a sundial. Actually, there's scientific. There's some amazing things that the Egyptians were doing. Their understanding was beyond us. I went to a place in Thebes, which is sort of halfway up the Nile. And this is where one of their universities was. And you go down under the ground, and it's got different rooms. And the rooms are lit by the sun, which hits onto a brass circle, and then another one, and it lights a certain room at a certain time of the year. So each day, as the sun, as it changes, it lights another room. That's the level they were on, right? Unbelievable level. The ancient Egyptians were on. So no, it was not necessarily built by slaves. I mean, slavery was an international phenomenon at that time. But really, the highest level, the understanding, the only way they could have moved those bricks or those stones is by a high level of science. It's not slave labor. You take 500 people and they're trying to carry a brick. You get 2 million bricks. How are you going to get it to the top? This is science, man. This is not people carrying it on their heads. This is a misunderstanding. And we will see tomorrow, inshallah, as we go into the whole concept of slavery, that in the ancient world, people were either master or slave. Everywhere in the world. It's not really to the 19th century that slavery actually ends. One scholar was even saying in the 19th century, up until the 19th century, maybe 2/3 of the world were actually slaves. So we're going to look at slavery in a broad sense, inshallah, tomorrow, so you really get an understanding of what it was. Okay? Good night.